Hi, welcome back to Live and Breathe Horses, and today we are going on with these wonderful stories about Tom Dorrance, which were collected and put together in the book by Margaret Dorrance and John St. Ryan. It's such an honour and pleasure to read these stories, and my intention would be that people will all go out and buy the book because stories need to be kept alive and keep being told, and that those who don't know Tom's work will get a familiarity with it and hopefully investigate further and put some of that into practice. And for those who do know Tom, hopefully you will enjoy the stories. So today's story comes from Jim Overstreet. For a few weeks in the 1960s, Tom Dorrance started Unbroken Horses at the Flying D Ranch in Montana near my home. Tom was already in his mid-50s then, but what he did there is still legendary. One morning, while the rest of the cowboys saddled for the day's ride, Tom roped and saddled an 8-year-old buckskin who'd been caught only once before, when he was branded and gelded as a yearling. Although the horse was tall, he stood stock still as Tom mounted. Even with Tom on top, the horse remained still. When another cowboy might have whipped the horse until he moved, Tom waited. "This might take a while," he joked with the other cowboys. "You may have to bring me my supper." Tom seemed to know when things were about to change. He's scared. When he starts, he won't buck, he'll run. Sure enough, in a few minutes, when Tom shifted his weight a little, the horse lifted one foot to keep his balance. Discovering that he could move, the buckskin burst forward as if he'd been shot out of a cannon. During the stampede across the large corral in front of the barn, Tom never tightened the reins. Only when the horse slowed in a corner to turn did Tom lift a single rein to more or less direct the buckskin through the turn. Minutes later, he rode out with the rest of the cowboys. Tom Dorrance was the most remarkable man I ever met. Quiet and self-effacing, he had no desire to be famous or rich, and most certainly had no instinct for self-promotion. He'd no ego in the conventional sense. Yet he possessed a genius with horses that was so extraordinary that people sought him out. As mysterious as his power with horses was, at least some of the important things Tom knew could be learned by other people. By the time that he died, the seeds he sowed had already created a revolution in horsemanship, much to the benefit of horses and riders everywhere. That you can trace this revolution in horsemanship to a single man is truly remarkable. It seems far too much to come in one leap or from one person. Tom credited an Oregon neighbour, Cliff Wade, with helping him learn to work with horses. However, Tom's approach changed dramatically and continually improved over the years. I suspect that he spent the biggest part of a lifetime learning to trust his own inclinations and understandings, his own special insights, and at the same time unlearning most of what other people had taught him. One of my strongest impressions of Tom is that he possessed an immense intellect, coupled with a kind of creativity that allowed him to see almost everything with fresh eyes. If he'd been born into different circumstances, he might have been an Einstein, a Galileo, or maybe an Edison. Later, I'll make an argument that for Tom, and for those of us who appreciate him, what he really had, and sometimes offered to us, was much more than mere horsemanship. Still, that he primarily applied such intellectual power to horses might seem a waste of talent. Tom was a stickler about getting the basics right, in the correct order. For example, At one of Tom's clinics, I spent the day on a horse that had some issues, but during the course of the day, he and I developed something of a rapport. The horse remained heavier into the bit than I'd have preferred, and was always a little slow to spawn to my direction. Still, he was much improved, and I was able to get him back and turn readily enough. I rode him again for a couple of hours the next day, and our rapport from the day before held together. At one point, Tom was directing me through a series of stops and starts at a walking pace. The horse didn't seem to be backing as well as he had the day before. I showed Tom what I'd been doing. Although the horse seemed to respond quicker and, to me, better, Tom looked up at me and said in a stern voice, "We're at 1, not 2. Tom wanted to get something right with this horse, both mentally and physically, at a very basic level before moving on. As near as I could tell, time meant nothing to Tom, at least when he was working with the horse. The fact that he could do things so quickly with horses was an accidental byproduct of his talent. Although I'm sure he liked being able to get a lot done, fast was not something he even considered. In fact, he often said, "The slow way is sometimes the quickest way to get there." Tom worked fast and efficient, but he did all things it took to keep the horse out of trouble and to ultimately get himself and the horse to where they needed to be together. Sometimes when I'm working with a horse, it may take me a month to accomplish something that Tom could have taken care of in a few minutes. But whenever I get where I want to go, and with an untroubled horse, I'm sure Tom would be pleased. When Tom was helping someone work with a horse, everybody might be working pretty serious for a while, and then Tom would say, "Let's take a breather." The horse, the rider, and Tom would relax for a few minutes and then start back at their project. Most of the time, at the new beginning, the horse and rider would discover that they were past whatever the problem was. The break itself had solved the problem. Brian Newbert's story about loading the retired rodeo bronco in a trailer is a classic example of how this can work. For a less dramatic example, a rider at one of Tom's clinics in Elko, Nevada, one fall, asked for help to get his horse to turn better. As Tom worked with this pair, it became clear that part of the difficulty was that the horse wasn't stepping across with his outside front foot. For 15 minutes, Tom made suggestions and the rider tried to make adjustments so that the horse could make the turn. When the progress stopped, Tom let the rider try harder for a few minutes, then he suggested a break. Some time later, when Tom turned his attention back to this horse and rider, he started them riding in circles, finally at a lope both ways. When things were going well and both horse and rider were relaxed, Tom had them stop for a few seconds and then asked them to try the turns again. The horse turned perfectly, reaching nicely over with the outside foot both ways. You might note that we're taking a step or two in each direction, not spinning. It's hard to have the patience to use this technique, but it's about as simple to learn as anything that Tom had to offer and can be highly effective. Tom disliked discord of any kind. He wanted people to get along with horses. He wanted horses to have reason to trust people. He wanted people to get along with each other. He had a strong bias in favour of harmony. I think this is one of his lessons to all of us. This trait could sometimes be counterproductive when you asked him for help with a horse. I say this with a smile. As Tom was directing you, he could, and sometimes would, keep you doing interesting things, while at the same time keeping you completely out of trouble. Looking back at a couple of those times, I'm sure that if I'd understood, this was his way of telling me that we weren't ready for what I wanted to do. However, in my impatience, I also found that if you plunged ahead and got into trouble, he would help you work your way out of it. Tom wanted the horse and the human to have a mutually beneficial relationship where each could trust the other to be aware of its needs. When the human wants something from the horse, Tom wanted him to ask nicely and certainly never demand. He wanted the human to present himself and his request to the horse in a way that the horse could understand and respond to appropriately. This means that the human needs to understand the horse enough to ask only for what the horse is prepared to do. It's all right for the human to ask the horse anything that the horse is capable of doing, but it's the human's responsibility to prepare the horse so that he can be ready to do whatever he's going to be asked to do. A few years ago, Tom helped me teach a young stud to be a gentleman so that I could ride him in public places. In addition to the other problems, the horse always resisted slightly when I bridled him. I had to use my thumb to pry his mouth open enough to slip the snaffle bit between his teeth. Tom no doubt noticed this problem the first evening, but never mentioned it until the third morning, when he suggested that we work on the bitting problem. We confined the horse in a narrow space. Tom directed me through a series of exercises to encourage him to open his mouth at my suggestion. I held the horse's head in my arms and between my arms and my body. Sometimes when he resisted more vigorously, I had to hang on real hard. When he became agitated, I tried to calm him by petting softly. During one of these episodes, when I was petting, Tom said, "Your hands are too hard." I'd been stroking him very lightly and replied, "I'm touching him as soft as I can." Tom looked at me and I suspect struggled to keep from exhibiting frustration. Then after a few seconds, he tapped his chest with the end of his curled finger and said very quietly, "It comes from the heart." He spoke in a lower voice than he had before and conveyed strong emotion. It was a strangely intimate moment, almost embarrassingly so. It was as if I'd forced him to open his soul to me so that I could see something so fundamentally important that I should have known it already. I stopped for a few seconds. I thought about the horse and how much I liked him. When my intention became good, my hands changed. They softened. Although I had been touching the horse very lightly, my fingers had been rigid. It had been as if I'd been trying to comfort Buddy by touching him lightly with a board. When the tension went out of my fingers, my touch became both light and soft. And I have no doubt that my shoulders and back softened too. My horse certainly did. In a few minutes, he took the bit perfectly. Because the horse had struggled hard enough to approach the limits of my ability to hang on, I'd had to tighten up and go into competitive mode. For a moment, it might have been appropriate, but when the horse was ready to quit fighting, I stayed stuck in what had become an unsuitable emotional state. It comes from the heart. Yes, Tom, you were right. It applies to so many things beside horses. As I mentioned earlier, when you were working with Tom, he would always keep you out of trouble with your horse if he could. Tom was helping me with a mare that I'd been riding for a while, but she always seemed to resist a little, no matter what I wanted to do. When I'd rein her, she would invariably take another step before changing direction. It was the same with almost anything. After our first session, Tom said, "You did break this mare to lead, didn't you?" I said that I'd bought her as a 3-year-old. On the third day, Tom had lost interest early, so I went to the arena and started doing other things. Tom stood back and watched, but didn't say anything until I started having trouble. He came to the fence and stopped me. Then he had me take the mare into a round corral at the end of the arena. He told me to tie a knot in the end of the reins and hang them over the saddle horn so that the reins drooped almost to her knees. Then he held up his middle finger and said, "Reach down the rein with your sore finger. Remember, it's real sore." Of course, my middle finger didn't hurt, but he wanted me to touch the rein and the mare's mouth as if it had. When I tipped the mare's head slightly each way, he said, "Fold your arms and don't do anything." When I complied, he said, "Now, ride her in a figure of 8. For a second, I sat there, dumbfounded, and he told me to look where I was going and squeeze gently to start her. After she began, I didn't move anything but my head and effortlessly rode her in a figure of 8. It was as if this mare could see out of my eyes for a few seconds. I'm still humbled and slightly perplexed by that experience. I try not to over-direct my horses, but that's a hard thing for a man to live up to. Sometimes Tom talked about a spiritual connection with horses. I can't pretend to know exactly what he meant by it, but it seemed to me that he used the word spiritual to mean several things. Part of it seems to be closely tied to the being quality that he felt with horses. Part may have to do with the deep down core sense of self or dignity inside the being of the horse that should be left unviolated, and part of it more complex. Years ago, a friend told me that Tom sometimes recommended a book called Kinship with All of Life by J. Allen Boone. It is so far out of the mainstream view of animals that it took me 2 or 3 readings over several years to grasp the clue it provided into how Tom's experience with horses. Boone describes a kind of mental telepathy between humans and animals. One of the ways Tom used the word spiritual seemed to describe that sort of thing. Whether or not you and I choose to believe in telepathic communication, Tom experienced something special that seemed telepathic to him. My clearest insight into Tom's magic arose out of an experience of my own. My family and I stopped to visit a friend of ours who lives alone with her dogs and cats. She was working in the garden, but stopped when we arrived. We visited for a few minutes while our girls, then 5 and 7, ran around the yard playing with the dogs and teasing our friend. In a few minutes, we said goodbye. As we began to drive away, I looked back at our friend, again working in her garden. She looked up at us briefly. Suddenly, it was as if I were her watching us drive away. I don't mean this metaphorically. For a moment, I had the actual visual experience of seeing us from her perspective. I also had the vivid emotional experience of her feeling a combination of a sense of relief that the wild running of the kids and dogs had stopped, and also a strong sense of loneliness. After I related this incident to Tom, I asked, "Do you do that with horses?" He looked at me and didn't answer for probably half a minute. It seemed much longer. Finally, he said, "You can make that work for you a half a mile away." Tom knows so much about horses and was so sympathetic towards them that for all practical purposes, he could literally see through their eyes. I don't mean to imply that it was a visual phenomenon only. I think it would be equally accurate to say that he could feel their feet or hear with their ears. Later, After he read a draft of an article I'd written about this, he told me he wouldn't change a word of it. I don't know how many times I heard Tom suggest that it's important to see from the horse's point of view. I'd always taken that to mean that you should try to be aware of the horse's needs, something quite different from literally seeing through the horse's eyes. Let me make an important distinction here. Any of us can imagine ourselves in the horse's position and feel what we would feel if we were in that situation. What Tom did was infinitely greater than that. When he looked out of the horse's eyes, for a moment, he managed to suspend his humanity and, in fact, become that horse. Tom's ability to do magic rested to a large extent on an ultimate degree of sympathy and telepathy, or otherwise. It was an ability that rose out of a deep knowledge of the horse. I suspect that as a young man, Tom didn't understand that other people saw horses differently. When he realised he had a vision other people didn't, he faced a near impossibility in trying to communicate what he knew to other people. It was something akin to trying to explain sound to a deaf person. You might be able to teach them to feel vibrations with their fingers, but it's a far cry from actually hearing. In his acceptance speech at the Cowboy Hall of Fame, Tom said, "I don't know what it is about me and the horse. I guess we just tried to be each other." I want to now approach this same topic from a slightly different perspective. Tom has frequently been like a Zen master. There are some parallels. I once sent Tom a few pages of Zen and the Art of Archery that began with a discussion of drawing the bow spiritually. He marked several passages and returned the copy to me. One of the places he marked said, "The shot will only go smoothly when it takes the archer by surprise." Later, he marked several places where the author or his master were talking about it shooting. This helped me understand that for Tom, what he did sometimes seemed to come from outside himself. I infer, therefore, that he was describing a non-conscious process. Tom sometimes talked about learning a technique as a three-step process. First, we have to concentrate to figure out what we want to do. Second, we have to make a conscious effort to coordinate our brain and muscles. Finally, after the coordination becomes through-going, we no longer have to involve conscious thought to complete the steps, but only have to think in terms of our goals. The point is that Tom didn't have to think about what he knew. For him, shifting in and out of the horse's point of view was a subconscious activity. So, knowledge isn't enough by itself, but has to be used until it becomes effortless. One of the characteristics of knowledge at this stage is that the user no longer has doubts, but feels certain. Another of the passages that Tom marked in Zen and the Art of Archery said, "Once you have known true egoless." Earlier, I described Tom as having little or no ego. That's probably one of his qualities that made this easier for him. In fact, I've come to believe that a prerequisite to do these things effortlessly and well is to have the ability to spend both the ego and the conscious will, at least momentarily. One day when Tom was helping me, I was holding the halter rope of my mare. It hung down from my hand in a large loose sag before climbing again to where it hooked into the halter. The mare seemed completely relaxed, standing still, not quite asleep. For some reason, Tom and I traded places. As near as I could tell, He held the rope exactly the same as I did. If anything, it drooped even more. He looked completely relaxed and certainly less threatening than I had. Slowly, with no alarm, and without so much of a resetting afoot, my mare came to attention. It was as if she'd been slumped with muscles almost completely relaxed, like you might do in a comfortable chair. Then, without really changing positions, her muscles firmed up, lifting her body ever so slightly, like you might do in that moment between deciding to get up out of that comfortable chair and actually rising. The mare was still comfortable, but for no apparent reason she seemed to regard Tom with more respect than she had me. It was as if there was a communication between Tom and horse on a level I could not sense. About a year later, when I remarked to Tom about this, he almost levitated from his chair. "That's what I mean," he said. "I wouldn't call it spiritual if I could think of any other way to describe it." At a clinic in Thermal, California, Tom was sitting near the arena fence on a small set of bleachers. Although the arena was large and there were horses in nearby paddocks, I noticed that even the first day, whenever the horses loose in the arena had a choice, they tended to gather close to the fence near Tom. I can relate to those horses. I like to be near Tom. He seemed to exude goodness. He gave me hope and energy. There was a kind of genuine simplicity about him that let you know that he always had both feet firmly on the ground. For a while, late in life, Tom did a series of small clinics in Central California. Many of the same people attended all that they could get to. Tom mentioned to me once that yes, lots of people came to his clinics, but that they didn't pay much attention and spent most of the time visiting with other people. He didn't think they got much out of it. I'm sure they got a lot out of the clinics, or they would not have kept coming back. Tom was helping people with horses, and I don't think he ever realised that a large portion of his audience wanted to be near him as much or more than they wanted to learn about horsemanship. I see Tom as more than a horseman. I see him as a kind of holy man, not somebody divine, but a type of earthly shaman, a man who knew the great truths of life and the universe in ways that the rest of us cannot. Horses and horsemanship were Tom's metaphor, through which he did his best to enlighten us to larger truths. Although I tried not to show it too much, I always felt both humble and reverent when I was around him. I'm pretty sure that I will visit Joseph, Oregon, as a kind of pilgrimage because Tom Dorrance was born there. What a beautiful, beautiful story. That was getting me all really emotional there. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for being with me today, and I look forward to see you next time.